A woman has been lying in the sand for almost 4,000 years and she still has her eyelashes. Not a skull. Not a shadow of a person, a face. Lashes, skin, the fine hairs on her arm, all of it still there. Long after everything else about her should have turned to dust. Long after the wooden markers standing guard over her grave should have rotted away in the wind. She was found in one of the harshest deserts on the planet. In western China, thousands of miles from where her features say she should be. Tall, deep-set eyes. A high narrow nose, hair somewhere between straw blonde and rust red. For 100 years, nobody could explain her, and she was not alone. Hundreds of bodies like her were pulled from that sand, wrapped in wool, buried in boats, watched over by strange wooden markers that still make no sense to the people who study them. Scientists spent a century arguing about where these people came from. Every theory pointed outward, to some distant homeland far to the west. Then someone finally read the one thing that could not lie. Their own DNA, and it did not confirm a single theory anyone had ever proposed. It didn't just correct the record. It rewrote who gets to claim the deep past of Asia at all. Let's start with the place that made any of this possible, because without it, none of these people would exist to us at all. It's called the Taklamakan, and even the name carries a warning. Locals have long translated it as something close to the place you go in, but don't come out of. It sits inside a massive basin in western China, walled in on every side by mountains, a bowl of sand, gravel, and salt so dry it barely qualifies as a place at all. Near its heart lies a dried lakebed called Lop Nur, a name that later became attached to Chinese nuclear testing. This is not a landscape built for memory. Everything about it should erase a person, not preserve them. Travelers along the old Silk Road avoided the Taklamakan whenever they could, skirting its edges along chains of oasis towns rather than risk crossing the open interior. Sandstorms here can bury an entire caravan in hours. Temperatures swing from scorching by day to bitter by night. Even now, with modern equipment and satellite mapping, large stretches of the basin remain difficult to survey properly. And yet, out of all that hostility, this basin does something unexpected. Somehow, it holds onto its dead better than almost anywhere else on Earth, in some ways, better than the tombs of Egypt ever managed. There was no embalming here. No priesthood, no ritual chemistry, no deliberate act of preservation at all. Just physics. The air here is savage in its dryness. The ground beneath it is thick with salt. Between those two forces, moisture doesn't just fade from a body, it gets pulled out of it, fast enough and completely enough that skin holds its shape, eyelashes stay rooted, and the fine down on someone's forearm survives for 40 centuries after the heart underneath it stopped. The desert wasn't trying to remember these people. It did it by accident. But because it did, when they finally came back into the light, they brought their own testimony with them. All anyone needed was the ability to read it. The first face to reappear surfaced in 1980, near an ancient site called Lulan. A team of Chinese archaeologists working on a documentary about the old Silk Road stumbled onto her, buried barely 3 feet down, wrapped in felt and wool. She would come to be known as the Beauty of Loulan. Radiocarbon dating placed her at nearly 4,000 years old, somewhere around 1800 BCE, and she looked nothing like what anyone expected to find in that stretch of desert. Not a skeleton picked clean by time. A face, still recognizably a face. But she wasn't even the strangest discovery waiting in that sand. Farther out, deeper into the desert, sat a site that would prove far more disturbing. Archaeologists call it Xiaohe, which translates to Small River Cemetery No. 5. Locally, some call it Ordek's Necropolis, named for the hunter who first guided outsiders to it decades earlier. When systematic excavation finally opened it in the early 2000s, it turned out to be one of the strangest burial grounds anyone had ever documented. The dead had been sealed inside hollowed logs shaped like boats, wrapped in raw hide and lowered into the sand. Above them, rising out of the dunes, stood an entire forest of carved wooden poles. Some rounded, some flattened into paddle shapes, arranged in patterns archaeologists still can't fully explain to this day. One woman recovered from that cemetery became known as the Beauty of Xiaohe. Like the woman from Lulan, her lashes had survived. So had her hair. She was found wearing a felted white hat, wrapped in a woolen cloak, her feet in boots lined with fur. And tucked close against her body, deliberately placed there by hands that vanished millennia ago, were small pouches packed with a plant called ephedra. That detail alone should make you pause, because nobody buries something by accident that many times in that many graves, across that many generations. Lulan and Xiaohe weren't the only sites the desert had been hiding, either. Other cemeteries scattered across the basin, at places with names like Karil and Yanbulak, turned up more of the same pattern. Bodies stretching across centuries. some with the same striking Western-looking features as the Xiaohe dead, others showing a mix that hinted at populations blending together as time went on. Layer after layer, site after site, the same unanswered question kept resurfacing. Who were these people, and just how long had they actually been living out there in that sand? What made Xiaohe extraordinary wasn't a single striking burial. It was the accumulation. Hundreds of individuals, preserved down to individual strands of hair, dressed in woven cloth, laid to rest with obvious care across generation after generation, in a landscape that should have made permanent settlement nearly impossible. And every single one of them handed researchers the exact same problem. They didn't match the land around them. They didn't resemble the people who live in that region today, and they didn't resemble the populations that history says arrived there later, either. The faces were the first sign that something didn't add up. Many of the bodies were tall, with deep-set eye sockets, high narrow noses, and hair ranging from pale flaxen to deep auburn, every strand kept intact by the salted ground. To the first researchers standing over these remains, the features looked distinctly Western, as if these people belonged somewhere thousands of miles away. And yet here they were, buried in the driest, most isolated corner of Western China. The clothing only deepened the puzzle. These weren't people scraping together crude hides to survive brutal winters. They wore finely woven wool, some of it patterned in twill and checks that reminded early researchers of textiles produced far away in Central Europe. Felt hats appeared again and again, carefully shaped, some elaborate. One man was reportedly buried with several of them stacked together. This was craft, this was style. And there was no obvious explanation for where the knowledge to produce it had come from, sitting in the middle of a desert with no evident trade network reaching that far back. Then there's the ephedra. Sprigs and pouches of it turn up over and over in these graves, tucked close against the bodies. Researchers have floated possible explanations, something medicinal, something ceremonial, but those remain interpretations built around the evidence, not something these people left behind in writing to confirm. What can be said with confidence is that it was intentional, repeated across the whole cemetery, generation after generation. Not an accident, a practice. And here's what turned this from a curiosity into a genuine scientific problem. These people were living deep in this basin more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road ever opened the region to trade. Centuries before Han Chinese populations established themselves there. Long before the Uyghur populations who call the region home today ever arrived. They predate almost everyone the written record accounts for. And they looked, by every early assessment, like they had no business being there at all. The researcher who did the most to drag this mystery in front of the wider world was Victor Mayer, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who encountered these mummies and simply could not let the question go. And it's the same question that should be forming in your mind right now. How does a population with these features end up buried in the middle of one of the most isolated deserts on the planet? Where did they actually come from? Every early instinct pointed west. And for decades, that's exactly what the field's most capable researchers set out to prove. Quick pause here because this is worth flagging. If mysteries like this are the kind of thing that pulls you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because everything you're about to hear about where these people supposedly came from is built on one shared assumption. And their own DNA is about to demolish it completely. You don't want to miss the moment that happens. So let's look at that assumption, because every serious theory about these people shared the same starting point. All of them agreed these people had arrived from somewhere else. The only real disagreement was over the route. One idea pointed toward the Afanasivo, a Bronze Age herding culture from the steppe country to the north, associated with the Altai Mountains. In this version of events, developed in part through the work of scholars including J.P. Mallory and Victor Mayer, the Tarim population descended from steppe migrants who pushed south into the basin, possibly carrying with them an early form of Tocharian, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family that would later surface in the region's written record. It's a tidy story. Herders move, and language and appearance travel south together along the same road. A second theory looked towards Central Asia instead, toward an oasis civilization known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a sophisticated network of irrigated settlements to the southwest, in what is now Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. In this reading, the founders of the Tarim population emerged from those farming cultures, bringing their irrigation knowledge, their metalwork, and their craftsmanship with them into the basin as they pushed east in search of new land. A third theory pointed to what's sometimes called the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor, a chain of high valleys and pasturelands running along the Tian Shan and Pamir ranges that could have funneled people down from the north and west into the basin over generations, moving flock by flock, season by season, rather than in one dramatic wave. Each theory had its defenders. Each had real evidence behind it, shared burial customs, similar tools, comparable textile techniques. And for years, researchers debated which map was correct, publishing papers, presenting at conferences, building entire careers around defending one route over the other two. 3 theories, 3 different maps. But notice what every one of them has in common. Each one draws an arrow pointing inward, toward the Tarim, from somewhere else entirely. Nobody in this debate was arguing over whether these people had migrated in. They were only arguing about which direction they'd migrated from. And that single shared assumption turned out to be the trap the entire field walked straight into. The genetic evidence available in the early years only thickened the fog rather than clearing it. Samples reportedly smuggled out of China in the early 1990s, at a time when formal research access was already becoming difficult, were said to show links to European ancestry, feeding the migration theories further and hardening the assumption that these were Western newcomers. Then, years later, a team led by Li Jin at Fudan University reported a more complicated picture, one that turned up East Asian and even South Asian genetic markers among the remains, muddying what had looked like a straightforward story. That finding was contested almost immediately. Mayer and other researchers pushed back on the methodology, and the overall picture stayed unresolved for years afterward. A scatter of partial, sometimes contradictory results pointing in different directions and never quite resolving into something solid enough to build a real conclusion on. Every few years, a new small study would surface, add a little more noise, and leave the central question exactly where it had been before. It got more complicated still because by this point the mummies had become political. To many Uyghur communities in the region, these ancient remains were treated as ancestors, and their existence was taken by some as evidence of a deep, prior claim to the land, a rootedness in the Tarim that predated every later arrival. Chinese authorities grew wary of exactly that kind of argument. Access to the remains tightened considerably. Museum displays changed. Researchers from outside China found it increasingly difficult to study the bodies firsthand. Samples became harder to obtain, and the science became entangled with a much larger ongoing dispute over who belongs to that land and for how long. That dispute is not something the story can resolve, and it's worth being upfront about that. The archaeology and the modern politics surrounding it are 2 separate questions that became extremely difficult to pull apart from each other, and any honest account of these mummies has to acknowledge that tension rather than pretend it doesn't exist. A set of striking Western-featured bodies preserved in a Chinese desert. Several competing migration theories, each with its own proposed homeland and travel route. Every one of them assuming these people had arrived from somewhere else. And underneath all of it, a set of remains that almost nobody outside China had been able to test using the one tool that could actually settle the question for good. That tool was their DNA, and after all those decades of argument, it had never really been properly read. Sit with that for a second. The entire debate revolved around a journey these people were assumed to have made. And the one record that couldn't lie about where they actually came from had been sitting inside them the whole time unread. The answer finally arrived in October of 2021, published in the journal Nature, in a paper examining the genomic origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin mummies. It was led by researcher Fan Zhang, working alongside an international team that included Christina Warner, an anthropologist affiliated with Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute, and Chungwon Zheng, an evolutionary geneticist who had spent years chasing exactly this question. For the first time, someone was going to read the founding population of the Tarim Basin directly from their own genomes. The team approached it carefully. They'd pulled genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest individuals recovered from the basin, 11 of them from the Xiaohe Cemetery itself, along with several more from the neighboring Jungarian Basin to the north. These weren't late arrivals or stragglers. These were among the oldest people the region had ever produced, dating to roughly the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. The actual founding generation. The very people every migration theory had been trying to explain. The logic going in was simple enough to hold in your head. Where there is migration, there are genes. If these people really had come from the west, from the Xiaohe Steppe, from the Central Asian oases, from anywhere at all, that homeland would have left a detectable signature stamped into their DNA. Find the signature, and you find the road they traveled. That was the entire plan. All they had to do was read what was already there, so they did. And what came back made no sense at first. The road wasn't there. There was no detectable Western Steppe ancestry in these people. No Xiaohe signal. None of the genetic fingerprints that a migration from the west or the north should have left behind. Decades of argument over which journey these people made, and the genomes returned a verdict that matched none of the proposed routes. The founding population of the Tarim was not descended from any migrating group at all. They were a genetically isolated local population, descended from people who had already been living in and around that region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before the first grave in that cemetery was ever dug. The genetic makeup itself was striking. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced back to a lineage geneticists called the Ancient North Eurasians. The remaining share, around 28%, came from a source geneticists classify as Ancient Northeast Asian. Read that back because it's the whole reversal condensed into one line. Every competing theory had proposed a different distant homeland that supposedly sent these people into the desert. And the genomes came back saying none of them did. Here's the detail that really gets under your skin. All around them, during that same Bronze Age window, neighboring populations were mixing freely, exchanging genes across the region in every direction the terrain allowed. The Tarim founders were not doing that. They sat right in the center of all that regional movement and stayed sealed off, marrying among themselves, absorbing essentially no outside ancestry. A genetic island sitting in the middle of constant traffic. Think about what that does to the mystery. It flips it completely. For 100 years, the question had been how these strangers arrived, which route carried them across a continent to eventually die in that sand. And the genomes erased the question entirely because there had never been an arrival to explain in the first place. These weren't migrants who traveled in and simply looked out of place. They were a population that had always been there, isolated and essentially unmoving, while the world around them turned over again and again. Which only deepens the real mystery, because if they never came from anywhere else, those distinctly Western-looking features still need an explanation. So who were they actually descended from? The trail runs back to a population that had very nearly vanished from the historical and genetic record altogether. Geneticists call them the Ancient North Eurasians. They were Ice Age hunter-gatherers from the Siberian interior, a people who spread across the frozen heart of the continent and then, as the glaciers retreated, faded out of the archaeological record almost everywhere they had ever lived. For a long time, researchers didn't even know this population had existed. They were a gap, a shape that other populations' DNA seemed to require in order to make sense. A ghost lineage visible only by its outline, never directly. Then a single body gave that ghost a face. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia, at a site called Malta, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago, near the peak of the last ice age, when glaciers smothered most of the northern world and human populations everywhere were being squeezed into isolated pockets just to survive. His remains had actually been excavated decades earlier, back in the 1920s, and sat largely unexamined for generations. It wasn't until a team led by S.K. Willerslev in Copenhagen finally sequenced his genome that the connection became clear. That boy, known to researchers as MA1, belonged to precisely the population scientists had long suspected existed but had never been able to confirm through an actual physical body. He was the first solid physical evidence of the Ancient North Eurasians. A ghost, finally made real, resting in a museum drawer for the better part of a century before anyone realized exactly what they were looking at. And here's why the word ghost genuinely fits. This population left behind almost no direct whole descendants, and yet their DNA is scattered across huge portions of the modern world. A significant share of Native American ancestry traces back to this lineage, with some estimates putting the figure between 14 and 38%. A meaningful portion of European ancestry runs back to the same source as well. Think about what that actually means. This vanished Ice Age population threaded fragments of its genetics into groups on opposite sides of the planet, populations that never met each other and never mixed with one another. And then the source population itself simply disappeared. It survives now almost entirely as fragments, buried inside other people who have no idea they're carrying it. Now hold that against the mummies, because that same ghost lineage, the one that survives almost nowhere on Earth as a complete intact population, is exactly what was lying in that Chinese desert the entire time. These weren't distant cousins of the Ancient North Eurasians. They were among the best preserved representatives of that lost population found anywhere on the planet, held intact by salt and dry air long after the lineage itself had faded out almost everywhere else it had ever existed. So those out-of-place faces were never actually out of place at all. They were simply old, older than any migration theory had ever reached for. And it turns out these people were carrying a second secret, one that has nothing to do with their bloodline at all. Because here's the paradox the same study uncovered, and it might be the strangest part of this entire story. These people were sealed shut by blood and thrown wide open by culture at the exact same time. Their own teeth gave it away. Traces of milk proteins and hardened dental plaque, showed they were dairy herders from the very beginning of the settlement, and their diet wove together the whole of Eurasia. Wheat and dairy that trace back to West Asia, millet that came from the East, ephedra drawn from Central Asian traditions. They borrowed farming knowledge, herding practices, and medicinal plants from every direction the compass offered them. And they married almost none of the people who brought that knowledge to them. Sit with that contradiction because it's genuinely difficult to hold in your head at once. A population open enough to import the diet and technology of an entire continent, and closed enough that virtually none of the people who carried those goods and ideas to them ever married into the community. Trade moved freely. Genes essentially did not. They absorbed an entire world's worth of technology while keeping their own bloodline almost completely untouched. Think about everything that had to travel to reach them. Wheat cultivation, developed far to the west, had to cross mountain ranges and desert corridors to reach their fields. Domesticated dairy animals, along with the knowledge of how to herd and milk them, had to be carried in the same way. The specific weaving techniques behind their patterned wool cloth point toward contact with textile traditions from far outside the basin. And ephedra, the plant tucked so deliberately into their graves, has documented uses in traditions stretching across Central Asia. None of that knowledge originated inside the Tarim. All of it arrived from outside, carried along trade and contact networks that clearly existed. And yet the community absorbing all of it stayed genetically closed the entire time. That's not a small coincidence. Researchers studying the cemetery describe it as one of the clearest examples anywhere in the ancient record of a population being culturally connected to the wider world while remaining biologically isolated from it. Step back because the scale of what those genomes rewrote is bigger than it first appears. This was never really a story about 13 bodies in one cemetery. It was a correction to how researchers understood the deep interior of Asia being settled in the first place. What the DNA revealed was an ancient, isolated Ice Age lineage surviving in place across thousands of years, holding its ground in one of the harshest basins on the planet, while every population around it turned over again and again through waves of migration. These people weren't a footnote to someone else's journey. They were the last surviving fragment of a world that had otherwise already ended. And that leaves a lesson sitting in the middle of the table, the kind that keeps researchers up at night thinking it through. Genes and culture do not have to travel together. There's a natural human instinct to assume that when ideas move, people move with them, that a new crop or a new tool arriving somewhere always means new blood arrived alongside it. The Tarim founders quietly proved that assumption wrong. A population can pull farming from one direction, herding from another, medicine from a third, and weave an entire continent's worth of knowledge into their daily lives without ever letting a single outsider into their bloodline. Isolation and cosmopolitanism sound like opposites. And yet here, they describe the exact same people at the exact same moment in time. So if the DNA answered the question of where they came from this cleanly, why does so much about them remain unresolved? Because the answer didn't close every door, and it would be dishonest to pretend that it did. Start with language. Whether these people actually spoke an early form of Tocharian, that extinct Indo-European language later documented in the region, simply cannot be extracted from DNA. Full stop. The scholar Elizabeth Wayland Barber has cautioned against assuming it too quickly, pointing to a gap of roughly 1,000 years between these mummies and the first written traces of Tocharian ever found. That's plenty of time for a language to move into a region without the underlying population changing at all. Other researchers, including linguist Ronald Him, argue the timeline could still work out. The honest position is that the evidence sits somewhere between those two views, and it isn't really anyone's place to force it firmly one way or the other without more proof. Then there's the question of scope. As powerful as this study was, it sampled essentially one time horizon at one site, a snapshot of the founding generation rather than the full population across the centuries that followed. As geneticist Vagish Narasimhan has pointed out, broader sampling across more of the basin and across later burial layers could still complicate this picture considerably, potentially revealing connections and later mixing events that 13 founding genomes simply weren't positioned to show. The Xiaohe Cemetery itself has multiple layers spanning generations, and only a portion of those layers have been genetically studied in real depth so far. And access itself remains a real obstacle. The political sensitivities surrounding the region, combined with ongoing restrictions on outside research, means the full record here is still far from completely read. A great deal of what these remains could still reveal stays locked behind both the sand and the circumstances surrounding it, waiting on a level of access researchers can't currently count on. So here's the honest position, and no further than the evidence actually supports. The DNA settled where the Tarim people came from, with a level of certainty nothing before it had come close to achieving. It did not settle their entire story. How an Ice Age relic population ended up thriving alone in the Taklamakan, holding together for thousands of years while quietly refusing every neighboring population, and what ultimately became of them as the centuries closed in over that cemetery, all of that remains only partly answered. The genomes gave researchers a beginning with real certainty. The middle and the end are still being pieced together out of fragments, and there's something almost humbling in that. A team of scientists, working with 13 ancient genomes and decades of accumulated theory stacked up behind them, managed to overturn a century of assumptions in a single study. And even after that breakthrough, the honest answer to most of the follow-up questions is still some version of "we don't fully know yet." That's not a failure of the research. That's what careful science actually looks like when it refuses to claim more certainty than the evidence has actually earned, one layer of sand at a time. So go back one final time to the desert and to the bodies it kept safe for so long. The beauty of Lulan, the beauty of Xiaohe, faces still intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years. Still wearing their felt hats, still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For 100 years, researchers treated them as strangers who had wandered in from somewhere far away, a migration puzzle waiting to be traced across a map. Their own DNA turned around and told a story stranger than that. They were the last of a people who were already ancient by the time they were buried. A ghost lineage out of the Ice Age, surviving now mostly as scattered fragments of code, carried quietly inside billions of people, and almost nowhere on Earth as a complete population of its own. And the desert still hasn't handed over everything it's holding: sealed graves, restricted archives, questions the sand has kept for 30 centuries, layer beneath layer, still being read one body at a time. Somewhere out past the dunes, more of that forest of carved wooden poles is likely still standing over graves nobody has opened yet, waiting on the same dry salt air that has already kept its secrets for 4,000 years and shows no sign of being in any hurry to give up the rest of them. If their DNA had never been read, do you think we'd still be calling them strangers today? Let me know what you think in the comments.